In this video, I'm going to talk about some statements made by essentially the fastest runner in the world right now, Noah Lyles, who said NBA players, and essentially carried it over to the NFL players, are not world champions because they simply just compete in the United States. I'm going to carry that statement over to boxing, where we have world champions. But before we get into that and listen to the groovy intro, if this is your first time here, I would like to welcome you and also ask you if you could subscribe to the channel, because it's a really great community, not just channel, where we have discussions and we don't yell at each other. Now, let's play the groovy intro. So Noah Lyles, as I said before, a famous track athlete, basically questioned the validity of world champions, especially in NBA players, because they basically just compete in the United States. I agree with this statement. I think this statement carries over to football, both the NFL and soccer for us Americans in Europe, because they play in, though athletes come from all over the world to play in these leagues, it's not a true representation of playing on a world playing field or a world dynamic. Whereas in boxing, we have fights we don't want to see. A German fighter might be number one. In the instance, we have Vincenzo, I can't say his last name, taking on Janibek. It's happening October 14th. It's two world-class fighters, one from Kazakhstan, one who hails from Germany. A lot of people aren't that interested in the fight, but it's two world champions competing for literally a world title because they represent different parts of the world and have earned this point through achievement. The big thing I'd like to talk about in this conversation is how the truly world-class sport of boxing, and also I think another one that comes to mind is tennis, which is a true world-class sport, which is happening right now, the U.S. Open, if you're a tennis fan in New York. These are not sports that are getting major television deals. If you look at the biggest problem in boxing currently, it's the friggin' streaming apps. If you're a casual boxing fan, you have to become a hardcore boxing fan very quickly to learn how to use all these streaming components and how to jump between devices, know the language and the landscape of where your favorite fighters typically, what platforms they're fighting on. There's a huge learning curve to boxing, whereas if you want to become an NBA fan, you know TNT will broadcast certain games. You know that ESPN will broadcast some games, at times ABC. They're very much centered around certain networks and often around certain times. Boxing is anarchy. We don't know what network, what time, when it's taken place. I think the worst example of this, although it was a great example for a fight fan, was the free boxing for all era of Premier Boxing Champions, where you could just flip it on, and even if you were a hardcore boxing fan, you could forget Spike TV had a fight card. You could forget that NBC was going to do a telecast for 2 hours. We now live in a paywall boxing era where everything's behind paywalls. You have to know how to find it, and this, that, and the third. NFL, NBA, two most popular sports in America. You could say MLB is up there, but it's kind of going the way of boxing. Those don't have as big of a paywall component. If you want to see everything, there's a paywall. But if you want to see your local market team and the games that are deemed as the best games in the country, you just turn on certain networks. Boxing does not have that. The best fights, typically, the big market fights, are going to be put behind a paywall, whether pay-per-view or a streaming service. So with Noah Lyles' comment, I agree that these athletes are not world champions based on that they're not competing on the world stage. But on a bigger scale, I also think that we are not appreciating world athletes, whether it's track and field, boxers, you name it, tennis players. For some reason, athletic sports that actually compete at the world level against the very best in the world, we're not as interested. We want it to be a very small elite focus to garner our attention, it feels like, because if it is truly a world-class thing, there's too many cast of characters. I get this feeling from college basketball, college football. It's too hard for me to follow it because there's too many players. I can't keep up with this guy, this, that, transfer, recruit. I think that's the problem that we run into and why we've stumbled across this one league, one monopoly, major marketing, video games, production, betting, gambling, create this infrastructure around a small, minute subsection, and then create content around that, as opposed to a truly global brand, global game that grows the game. That's a much more complicated, and you're going to dilute the process, or you're going to lose people in the process because there's going to be so much knowledge that comes in. Boxing is falling behind other sports because there's so much that the viewer and the participant that wants to be a fan has to learn on their own in order to be an educated boxing fan. Even if you try your best as a media outlet, as I do with my newsletter, with this, with my work at ProBox, there's still a lot of learning the person that's following boxing has to do, because there's not a lot of common sense, logic, or rubric to it. You could have 5 fights on DAZN in one weekend, and maybe a couple of them are advertised, but guess what? DAZN doesn't seem to advertise on regular network television. So are you even going to be aware that DAZN is having these fights unless you keep up with very hardcore, small market boxing channels? That's the same as track and field to many regards, where track and field, very interesting sport, world class, they're always competing against the best. But unless you participate in it or you're a super fan, do you really know when these events are popping up until the Olympics? Probably not. I think it's interesting that basketball players and football players are getting frustrated at this statement. And I get that they could say, okay, everyone wants to play in these leagues and it does consist of the best. But I do think this is an argument we need to have, that these sports truly are more a representation of the United States and a Western world than the world at large. And it's interesting that some of these sports that are more of a representation of the world are actually going on the back burner currently. I want to know, community, what is your thoughts on this topic? I thought it was a very compelling topic that my good friend Mike Lee called my phone to ask me to do a video on. So there it is. That's my take. Leave some comments in the chat to let me know what you think.